Live on WFLA Now. With a specialized degree in climate, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Specialist Jeff Berardelli is pioneering the way we look at climate and extreme weather. Welcome to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by ArmorView Window and Door.
All right, hey everybody, thanks for joining me today. In today's Climate Classroom, an extremely important topic. We are talking about Earth's most important ocean current system. It's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC for short. It is vital because it transports a lot of heat from the equator to the poles and it regulates our climate patterns. Now, in recent decades, it's been slowing down because of our warming climate. But until a few years ago, it seemed that an all-out collapse would probably not happen this century. However, there have been multiple news studies that show it may happen much sooner, perhaps in the next couple to few decades. Now, if this were to happen, the implications to our climate system and humanity as a whole may be huge. To help us better understand this topic for today's Climate Classroom, we are interviewing one of the world's #1 experts on the AMOC. It is Dr. Stefan Rahmstorf. He is from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, so I will bring him into the picture. How are you, sir? Thank you for joining me. Thank you so much for taking your time out today to join myself and Val Simpson to discuss this important topic.
Hi, Jeff. Very nice to be on your show.
So for the folks at home, the person that you see right here, the one in the middle, is the world's leading expert on this particular subject. He's been doing a lot of research for a while. And I think the first thing that we have to explain, Stefan, if you can kind of take us through it, is can you tell people what the AMOC is and why it is, in fact, such a vital circulation?
Yeah, sure. And I have actually been studying this for more than 30 years. The AMOC is a big overturning circulation in the Atlantic, which consists of a northward flow all the way from South Africa through the South Atlantic, across the equator, towards the high latitude North Atlantic. And there, this flow gives off its heat to the atmosphere, loses heat, the water gets cold enough to sink. And so it sinks down to between 2,000 and 3,000 meters depth. And at that depth, it returns to the south as a so-called deep western boundary current. So that works exactly like a central heating system for the northern Atlantic region, because warm water is flowing at the surface towards us and cold water is flowing at the ocean depth back to the south. And so it brings not only heat from the equator to the northern high latitudes, but actually right from the far south, from the latitudes of South Africa, right up to us, across the equator even.
So Val, it looks like you have a question.
It sounds almost like it's some sort of a conveyor belt that is moving water around, correct?
Exactly. It looks like a conveyor belt.
Very good.
So you know what? I have a graphic. So let me put this graphic. I built this. Okay, I'm impressed by it. You guys might not be, but I like it. Okay.
I remember you working on this.
Yes, I think I did a decent job. Okay, I'm not an artist, so just keep that in mind. But and I didn't include all of the caveats and all of the nooks and crannies. I just tried to make a generalization about it. But you can see that red line is the surface current, making its way from the South Atlantic northward and eventually into the Caribbean. Now, why is this not working? Hold on. For some reason, it's not moving.
Okay. Hold on. Take a moment there.
Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Here we go. All right, so for the folks that are watching from Florida, it's...
now it doesn't go across Florida, which is better.
What'd you say?
That's better if it doesn't go across Florida, but
you don't think it should go into the Gulf?
It's perfect as it is now, and it should actually... it's the Gulf Stream, which then goes northward along the Florida coast until Cape Hatteras and leaves the American coast there. Yeah, you've now nicely shifted it so it doesn't go across Iceland, but...
and it's also why it's so warm. It's also one of the reasons why it stays so temperate and moderate in the UK, right?
Exactly. It delivers a huge amount of heat in the region to the west of the British Isles, to the south of Iceland. That's where it gives off most of its heat to the atmosphere. And with the westerly winds, that kind of warmed atmosphere then blows into Britain and even, into Scandinavia, to Europe. There's actually also a branch of it that doesn't turn back south of Iceland, but goes up the Norwegian coast into the Nordic seas.
Yeah, I cut it off there for simplicity.
Yeah.
But
what is going on right now?
Well, wait, I'm showing the sinking there.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Because he talked about giving off heat to the atmosphere.
Yes.
At that point, it usually begins to sink.
Okay.
But the problem that we have, Stefan, right, is that because it's warming at around 2 to 3 times the rate of the global average up in Greenland, that's one of the ways that this fresh water, this melting, is getting into the North Atlantic and disrupting that sinking, right?
Exactly. That water can only sink if it's very heavy. And water gets heavy when either it is cold or it is quite salty. And so the combination of both things, that it's cold and that it's relatively salty, drives that sinking motion. And so if you add fresh water for more rainfall, which is happening with global warming in those latitudes, and meltwater from the sea ice, from the Greenland ice sheet, that dilutes the ocean there, it is actually getting less salty there. Its salinity in this region is now the lowest that it's been since the beginning of observations 120 years ago. And that inhibits the sinking of that water.
So the fresh water in the North Atlantic due primarily to Greenland, but also to an increase in rainfall, perhaps, and also a decrease in the amount of sea ice created in the North Atlantic is freshening the water there. So it's not sinking as much. And you tell me, I think you did some of the research on how much it's slowed down. Last I read a few years ago, it was about a 15% slowdown in the past 50 or 60 years. That seems like a tremendous amount. Is that still correct, that number?
Yeah, that is still correct. And your listeners might wonder, why don't we know exactly? And it's because we haven't been measuring this current system for 100 years. We've only been measuring it since 2004 at 1 latitude at 26 degrees north, because this is tremendously costly. You have to put lots of devices across the whole ocean down to the depth, measuring in various depths and locations. And so what we do is we use this heating effect by that current to see how it's doing. So if you look at climate models, the region south of Greenland to the west of the British Isles, the temperature there is a good indicator of how strong that current is going. And that region is the only part on the planet which has cooled in the last 100 years and still also in the last few decades. And that is an indication of that current having slowed. And that is, here's a nice picture since 1940 from reanalysis data. You see how this region that has cooled there, it's called the cold blob, or sometimes the warming hole. So that cooling is an indication that less heat is being delivered to that area by the AMOC.
Pretty amazing when you look at it internationally. I'm going to just show one more graphic, then Val, you can jump in. But I have a graphic that Ed Hawkins made. I love Ed. Ed and I are pals. And the reason why I love this is it doesn't actually. So just to be clear about this graphic, I'm going to put it up on the screen. It shows temperature change relative to the global average. Now, the whole globe, for the most part, is warming, with one exception, that cold blob in the North Atlantic. But just about every other place is warming. This just shows how fast, relative to other places, to the global average, how fast it's warming. And what I love in this graphic is, it's warming in the southern Pacific there and in the Indian Ocean. It's just not warming as fast. And so Ed colors that area blue because it's warming less fast. But look at the North Atlantic in this illustration. It really sticks out. It's not just not warming as fast, it's simply actually cooling, unlike the rest of the planet. You can really see how a disruption in the AMOC is causing one of the only places on Earth to actually cool while everything else is warming. So I don't know. I happen to love that illustration because I think it really shows the cold blob almost better than anything that I've seen.
Yeah, and it strikes you immediately that something very unique on the planet is happening exactly in that region. And we know the same thing from Earth history. I have studied ice age cycles also since the 1990s. We do model simulations of those. And during the last ice age, there were abrupt climate changes that also have this big center of action in the Northern Atlantic. And so there is very strong evidence that instabilities of the AMOC have caused massive climate shifts in the last ice age, so more than 10,000 years ago.
So we know that it happens because it has happened before. I was explaining to Val how, a lot of climate systems, you can slow them down gradually, you can speed them up gradually, but there's a switch here, right? We know that there's a point at which this is going to tip and it will possibly just shut down. Is that right? So talk about what we're looking for as we go forward into the next few decades. This is becoming more of a reality than perhaps the climate models or that the IPCC led on just 10 years ago.
Yes, this is a classic tipping point of the climate system, and it's due to the fact that the northern Atlantic, where that water sinks, is salty because the AMOC brings salty water from the subtropics there. And this flow is going because the water can sink there. So if you interrupt this process by diluting the fresh water, the AMOC slows, brings less salty water there. That is slows it even further. So it's a self-amplifying feedback. And at a certain point, this becomes a vicious circle where by itself, the circulation is doomed and will collapse. And yeah, that has happened several times in history, and that this could happen due to global warming was first described by the famous American oceanographer Wally Broca.
I took a class with Wally.
And he published in 1987 in the top journal Nature a warning about unpleasant surprises in the greenhouse, pointing out that in the Earth history, climate hasn't changed gradually, but there are these really abrupt changes caused by these instabilities in the ocean circulation. And this could happen again because with global warming, we're diluting the surface ocean, we're also warming it, and that inhibits the sinking of that water. And until, I would say, a few years ago, maybe even just 3 years ago, we all discussed this as a low probability but high impact risk. So, it's one of the accidents that can happen with global warming, but it's not the most likely outcome. And I would still say that's not what it is, but the idea that it's actually a low probability, like a few percent or so happening this century, that we pass this tipping point, I think that is outdated, unfortunately, now, because a whole slew of newer studies are showing that we are probably much closer than we think to this tipping point, and that models have so far underestimated this risk.
Val, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I did, because I did see your presentation that you have pinned on your social media on X, and you do talk about the tipping point. And one of the questions that I had is, what will the signs be when we get close to that tipping point? Because it sounds from what you're saying that we're not there yet. So what are those signs that we need to look for?
The signs are that, people are trying to look for signs in the observational data. Sorry, I lost one light apparently. I hope you can still see me.
Yep.
We can see you. We can see you.
Yes, you're in a very romantic setting right now. Your front lit,
okay.
Dark in the background.
Yeah. So if you're approaching a tipping point in any system in physics, this is not special to climate, this comes from nonlinear physics, then the variations change. That's a kind of random wiggling about of a system around its mean state. And you can see a phenomenon called critical slowing down. So if you disturb the system, it takes longer to return back to its equilibrium. And that is characteristic for approaching a tipping point. And there have been 4 or 5 studies now that have been published looking at data, trying to look for early warning signals that we may be approaching this tipping point. And they all found that basically already in this century, even in the first half of this century, so in the next decades, we may be approaching this AMOC tipping point.
Yeah.
Now, I should add one thing that, because otherwise people will misunderstand, this tipping point doesn't mean that the collapse of the AMOC happens like in a matter of a few years or even weeks, like in the movie The Day After Tomorrow.
Yeah.
It does take then typically around 100 years to gradually wind down to grind to a halt, basically. I mean,
Gotcha.
once you're beyond the tipping point, it really already starts its unstoppable decline. But it takes a while because it's a system that has a certain inertia.
And I do have a follow-up question to that. So what are the impacts that we will see, and who will be affected by the impacts of the slowdown?
Well, you've seen already that cold blob that is out in the North Atlantic and actually over the North Atlantic, also in the air temperature. And when this system slows down further or even breaks down, right, then that cold blob will get bigger and bigger, and it will actually expand over land areas. So that means especially Great Britain, Scandinavia, Iceland will start to see some very substantial cooling, even well below pre-industrial temperatures. And so that's the most obvious impact, which is already pretty disastrous. But there is also, for the United States, the problem of additional sea level rise on top of the global average sea level rise because of that ocean circulation change. So it could be like an extra ½ meter or even a meter extra. And
That's a
then
lot.
there's reduced, because that deep water brings oxygen down to the deep sea. If that stops, you get an increasing problem with oxygen depleted zones in the deep ocean. And also it takes carbon dioxide with it, because the ocean is now at its surface taking up about a quarter of the added carbon dioxide that we put out of our chimneys and car exhausts. A quarter of that is taken up by the ocean and locked away from the atmosphere in the deep sea by those sinking regions. And so when that gets interrupted, the CO2 content in the atmosphere will rise even faster, because more of our emissions will stay in the atmosphere.
Yeah, there's obviously, and I think it's hard for just a layman person to understand just how disrupting the AMOC could throw so much off kilter around the world. You talked about cooling off Great Britain and Northern Europe to a large degree. People may not understand why that even matters. The atmosphere is warming, so if we cool it off a few degrees, people may think, well, that's not a big deal. It'll just be more temperate during the summertime. But obviously that has tremendous impacts on agriculture, right? I mean, what are the impact? Let's just take one impact at a time. Let's talk about the impact on Europe if it cools down. Why is that important if it cools down a few to several degrees?
Well, we then will have much greater temperature difference between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, because Southern Europe will still warm because of the extra CO2, but Northern Europe will cool. And so the temperature difference gets larger, and it's these temperature differences that drive winds, for example, and also the variability of weather. Where I live here, I live kind of in the middle between that region that would warm in the south and the region that would cool in the north. We get a lot of temperature weather variability depending on whether we get cold air coming in from the north or whether we get warm air coming up from Spain or North Africa. And if the temperature contrast gets much, much larger between these air masses, we will see totally unprecedented weather extremes. It's very difficult to tell you in detail what they will be.
Yeah.
It's hard to predict, but it's pretty certain that it would be really crazy weather extremes.
Yeah, and kind of, I think that the point you're trying to make, Jeff, is that with weather extremes, for instance, where we get our food is affected, correct? Like when we start seeing these changes in the temperatures, how we grow our food, for instance, that's a way that it could impact, what we eat.
Exactly. I mean, now just this morning on the radio, I heard that this year, the fruit harvest, especially apple harvests around here, have lost about 80%. They're down by 80%. So,
wow.
And that is simply because one of those cold air masses came in relatively late from the north, and when the blossoms were already out, and basically destroyed them. And so this would certainly have a massive impact on agriculture in the northern parts of Europe.
We see that the heating is having a huge impact in places like Italy, where it's really hard to grow olive oil.
Yes.
Olive trees, which is I'm Italian, so I do pay very close attention to that. So that's one aspect. Okay, the other thing you talked about, which for the U.S. would be very important, you mentioned that if the AMOC completely collapsed, and it took a while to totally collapse, but we would see a buildup essentially of water on the east coast of the United States because you're not transporting as much water across the Atlantic, right? In fact, let me bring the animation up. People can understand that if that red arrow kind of collapses, that transport stops. Then now we're building up a higher sea level on the western side of the Atlantic Basin.
So what does that mean?
Right.
For
So yeah,
housing?
you said a half a meter to maybe a meter of extra sea level rise on the east coast of the U.S. It's possible in the long term.
Yes, and that is because if you look at the Gulf Stream going up the coast there, that as you showed in your diagram, the Coriolis force from the Earth rotation pushes the water to the right, and that's why on the right-hand side of the Gulf Stream, the sea level is about a meter higher compared to the left-hand side of the Gulf Stream. And that effect will basically decline when the AMOC collapses. And so we did some model simulations on that, published already in 2005, which shows that in a lot of the northern Atlantic, basically mostly towards the left side of that surface current, the sea level will rise in addition to the global mean sea level rise that we get around the world anyway.
Right. So those are two big things, and I think, I when I hear about, especially the cool,
one more light.
Oh, wait a second!
No, now
he's disappearing.
Lights out.
I can turn on my. Sorry, these lights run on battery. I'll turn on another light.
You know what?
Okay.
I'm gonna take you off the screen and I'll put this graphic up. You know, it's funny, Val, because Stefan was mentioning something about how he's like it's crossing Florida. I didn't understand what he meant. Now I know. Look what I did. When you're zoomed out on this graphic right here, it looks like
it's going over the state.
It looks like it's going across the state, but in reality, when you zoom in, so I need to fix that. I was so proud of this animation.
No, I mean it's really good. It's really good.
Yeah.
It looks like
It's because it's a 3D graphic.
That's right.
Those arrows floating above the surface.
I told you I'm not an artist. Okay,
we're back. We are getting a lot of comments. I have a question here. I'm going to read it, and maybe you guys can answer for some of our folks. So this is from David Faisal. He says, with global warming, will there ever be another ice age in the future, or is ice age gone forever?
Well, not forever. You know, these ice ages, they are caused by the Earth orbital cycles, and normally the next ice age would be due in 50,000 years from now. But we have already emitted so much CO2 into the atmosphere, and it stays there for hundreds of thousands of years. It's very slowly decays by being put into the deep ocean sediments. So we've basically already prevented the next ice age, most likely that would be due in 50,000 years. And if we keep emitting, we will prevent more and more of the future ice ages up to 1 million years into the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is an interesting thought because people always think, well, yeah, we've warmed things so much. We have so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's so much warming in the oceans that, especially if we can't reverse this in the next, century or so, I don't know if we'll have to, if we can't reverse it in the next century or two, we may not have to worry about what happens 50,000 years from now. At least humans won't have to worry.
Exactly. I mean, we have now, really, we should be worrying about what's happening in the next 100 years or so, maybe a few hundred years. I'm not terribly worried about things in 50,000 years, to be honest.
Yeah, sure, of course. Any other questions, Val? Because we're already kind of over time.
We're over time. People are leaving comments. Yeah, I'll take, if you guys want to take another one. Folks are leaving comments saying that heating and cooling is a normal process of the planet.
Yeah, we get that all the time. And he just kind of addressed that.
With that, okay.
So you can talk more about it. People are just saying, look, this heating and cooling, these slowdowns of circulations, this is normal. What do you say to that, Stefan?
Well, I'm actually a paleoclimatologist. As I said, I've studied ice age cycles and also longer term climate changes. And First of all, when people say it happens all the time, some people mean, how do we know it's caused by humans this time? Well, we simply do know that because we know where the carbon dioxide is coming from, and we know what effect it has. And this effect was actually predicted before it happened. Even the Swedish Nobel laureate Svante Arrhenius already calculated in 1896 how much global warming you would get when you double the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is what we are well on the way of doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other argument that people have when they say, well, look, its planet has heated and cooled all the time in the past, is maybe they say it's harmless. But that's not the case for us. If you want to have a time where the carbon dioxide was as high as now, you have to go back at least 15 million years. And that was a very different climate. There was no ice sheets on Earth. Sea level was 65 meters higher. Do we want that? Homo sapiens, us, we've only been around for 300,000 years. And so we are basically children of the ice ages, which have dominated in the last 300,000 years. And we are simply not adapted to such a warm climate. As we are heading towards now, we've already left the Holocene climate where humans invented agriculture and built cities and thrived. And all our agriculture, all our infrastructure is not adapted to a much warmer climate with higher sea levels. We've built a lot of our big cities right where the coastline is now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it won't stay there. In the last ice age, only 20,000 years ago, sea level was 120 meters lower. And so the coastline was in a very different place. So global warming is not harmless. This is what the history of climate really tells us. It tells us, A, the climate is sensitive to carbon dioxide. It has always been. And the consequences of climate change can be severe. It can be abrupt. It massively changes monsoon systems, tropical rainfall belts,
the
the
systems that we
vegetation
count
of
on.
the planet. And we now have to feed 8 billion people.
Yes. But yeah.
So I guess the question that I have is, what can we do then to avoid the collapse of the AMOC?
Well, the only thing we can do is stop the warming as soon as possible. And the world has agreed to that anyway in the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, many countries are not really doing enough, including my own country, Germany, and we're now already at 1.3 degrees. So basically, we have to cut down global emissions very rapidly in a matter of 10, 20 years and approaching zero emissions by 2050.
So I have a bit of a selfish question. I just want to make one comment to the folks who are watching, though, who say that, the climate has always changed. It always will change. Just, you may have missed him say it, but he is a paleoclimatologist. So this is what he studies for a living.
Coming from the horse's mouth.
Yes. He looks at proxy records, paleo records that go back hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, to look at how the climate has changed. And sometimes that change is abrupt. It doesn't necessarily always happen very gradually. All right. What I want to, the selfish question I have, Stefan, is because I do the weather here in Florida and I'm very concerned about hurricane seasons. I am curious, if you stop transporting all of this equator heat, all of this heat down here in the tropics and subtropics to the North Atlantic, do you end up accumulating heat, and do ocean temperatures in the tropics and subtropics end up increasing in the long term if the AMOC collapses?
Well, they are increasing anyway, of course, from the increased greenhouse gases. We're already seeing that, but the AMOC slowdown can also add something to that. I don't think it's going to be a huge amount because, as I mentioned earlier, the AMOC is not just transporting heat from the tropics to the higher latitudes. It's coming all the way across the equator, etc. But yeah, if you shut down the AMOC, you get some additional heating in the tropical regions.
Okay, I appreciate it. Well, listen, Val, we probably have to cut this short because we're already about 10 minutes over.
We do have a couple more questions. People wondering about
You wanna ask
that
one
live
more?
in the East Coast. Well, yeah, somebody said something like, with the water level increase, Eastern Coast, what? I'm getting the H out of here. They want to move out of now they're getting scared.
Well, yeah, right. And it's not going to happen tomorrow. But go ahead, Stefan. People are concerned now that we could see extra sea level rise on the East Coast and what it means to them and them living there.
Yes, I mean, if you have a beachfront property, that is bad news, obviously. And I know that New York City is already making big planning efforts to protect Manhattan from the rising seas, because we have, of course, not just in the US East Coast, but everywhere on the planet, a lot of vulnerable infrastructure right at the coast at low level, like airports, nuclear power plants that take their cooling water from the sea, and of course, people simply living there because they like living just right near the beach.
Right.
All right. Well, hopefully people will start recognizing the dangers here, not only take the precautions they need to help themselves in their situation, but also communally help the planet so that we can avoid what could be a catastrophe if, in fact, we reach this tipping point and if, in fact, the AMOC were to collapse. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramsdorf, for being here. We really, really appreciate it. I know it's late there, so hopefully you have a wonderful evening. Yes. And Val, thank you so much, as usual. It's always fun to have you on the program. I want to thank all of you at home for joining me. Just a reminder, one thing, you can go to our website if you want to read more about this and have a link to some of Dr. Ramsdorf's research. You can go to the article on our website, go to the weather tab, and then go to Climate Classroom and click on that right there. As usual, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. You can also watch us on YouTube later today. We'll have this packaged up and sent there. This also, by the way, is a podcast, so you can listen to it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. Thank you very much.
Watch or listen to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by ArmorView Window and Door on WFLA social media platforms, and find Jeff's climate reports on WFLA.com.